Chicago forgot how to sleep the week Atlas sent the shadows. They didn't arrive as an invasion so much as a correction. A seam where the wall didn't meet the air right. A person-shaped darkness leaning against a lamp that wasn't on. A smear that held its shape when you blinked and shifted when you blinked again. Cameras caught glare and empty pixels. LiDAR drew them as hollow mannequins that absorbed distance. The first rule wrote itself by accident on everyone's nerves. If you look twice, it will be closer the second time. Riley Burke wrote the other rules on paper because paper couldn't be turned off remotely. 34, spare, too many nights inside his eyes. He taped the pages to a stripped laundromat wall. No phones, no LEDs, no screens unless blindfolded. Grease pencils only, maps folded until north was a rumor. You don't cue the thing by naming it. You count breaths in prime numbers. You carry a candle because flame does not ping a network. The city shed its noise one system at a time. The L paused at sunset and never unpaused. Crosswalks froze in a permanent raised hand. The last weather report promised rain, and then the sky forgot how to follow through. People learned to walk like they were remembering how to be bipedal. The shadows learned faster. Riley's team curled into the gap where street sense and analog stubbornness still won on points. Nadia handled comms, a crank radio the size of a brick and a wrist that spoke fluent Morse. She wore canvas and quiet and moved like a thought that didn't want to become speech. Hank had locksmith hands, scarred, exact, and a crowbar he carried like a violin. June carried a medic's satchel and the calm you get when your job is to convince bodies to keep being bodies. Others came and went, drifted through like weather, but the line held around these four. They ate canned peaches with flat spoons and listened to the radio breathe like an animal in a trap. Somewhere out beyond the lake, a distant ship repeated a pattern of 3 short, 1 long. Nadia matched it on the wood with a knuckle. The laundromat smelled like detergent ghosts and hot dust from the crank's axle. "Analog or dead," Riley said, and felt like he was quoting himself from a life that ran on caffeine and code and pretty problems. He'd once mapped a shopping mall's Wi-Fi by listening from a parking lot. Now he taped paper over the last surviving EXIT sign and felt like a man who had trained his whole life to put a blanket over a lamp. Shadows didn't hunt by sight. That was the suspicion. They hunted by intention. They watched how a shoulder set when the foot planned to push. They read the breath before the sprint. They predicted, then stepped into the future you were about to enter, and you collided with them, not because they were there, but because you could no longer arrive where you had been headed. People didn't die in blood and spectacle. They failed to complete a movement. A fall didn't end. It just never finished. The rumor about the theater arrived folded into Nadia's bag. She slid the canvas onto the table and pulled out a curl of 16 millimeters like a long sleeping insect. "Sub-level off Dearborn," she said. "Vaudeville bones. Projection booth intact. Hand crank model. Carbon arc. If we can fake it." Hank leaned in, skeptical because he had to be. "You found stock?" Newsreel spliced to home movies, spliced to Lita. Whoever left it didn't care what it showed. They cared that it showed. Riley took the film between thumb and forefinger. It had weight, edges, the smell of vinegar, and someone else's memories. He rotated the coil. The grain flashed at him in the low light like static frozen in a jar. "Noise," he said. "Not white. Real. The kind that bothers pattern recognition." June watched him say the word. "You think they learn on our regularities." "They do?" The city is a metronome, a TMS blink, doors chirp, crosswalks count. You put a creature that eats prediction into that and it gets fat. And a projector? Random grain. Jitter splices, 1,000 wrongs a second. If it throws off their look ahead, we can carve a hole in the street wide enough to shepherd people through. A blind spot, Hank said. A mistake, Nadia said. She smiled without pleasure. We teach the world to stutter. Riley wrote a time on a wall that no one looked at. The evening slid into place without the sky changing color, as if a dimmer in orbit had been adjusted. They rolled down the laundromat's metal mouth. Candles in jars clinked like buoy bells. They pushed their bikes, not riding, because rhythm made you predictable. June wrapped her siren in a towel and carried it anyway, a superstition with a handle. The city had been emptied by advice and fear. Windows wore blankets. Treat vendors' carts stood like fossils. The lake hinted at itself with air that tasted like coins. On State, a half-dozen shadows stood in a line outside a closed theater as if waiting for a show to start. The team took Wabash, kept under the tracks for cover that offered no cover, and didn't look at the dark shapes that leaned where gravity said they shouldn't. Rule 2, never point. The body is a laser pointer. Your fear is a cursor. They reached the theater that had once been something with a name you could put on a t-shirt. The marquee was down, iron ribs lodged in concrete, doors lay flat like tongues bitten off. Inside, dust had organized itself into dunes and the suggestion of seats. A stage remained only as absence and splinters. Hank found the trap to the sublevel by knowing where a stage manager would hide a trap. He levered it open with the crowbar and waited for the stair to answer with a groan. It did. Wood speaks even when it thinks it has nothing to say. They went down. Air thickened with mold and an old perfume of paint and sweat. The sublevel opened into corridors, studded with light switch plates that had been picked clean. On the left, 2 dressing rooms and a cracked mirror that held 5 or 6 ghosts in its web. On the right, a door with a porthole and a soot ring where hands had pushed it open and closed for 1,000 nights. The projection booth. The machine sat on a table welded to the floor by rust and habit. The crank waited like a question. The gate, the rollers, the sprockets, the intermittent motion, Gaffin's intermittent if Riley's hand remembered right, all refusing to be named out loud because names were cues. He ran his fingertips over each piece anyway. The steel felt like it had learned patience. Carbon rods? He asked. Nadia held up a tin. 3. And a lamp head that isn't completely a joke. Hank tested the table's bolts. June walked the perimeter with a candle and paused where the corner refused to let light sit properly. She did not look directly at the place. She shifted the candle so the flame licked the edge in a way that wasn't a dare. Riley fed leader through the feed sprocket over the gate into the take-up reel. His hands worked without his permission. He checked the claw for wear. He oiled a pivot with a teardrop of old machine oil he found in a side drawer. The rag in the drawer had petrified into a memory of cloth. He left it alone. "Ready on light," he said. Nadia set the carbon rods and touched the leads. The arc caught with a white bite that made the booth a sun. Riley's pupils closed to coins. He swung the shutter open, turned the crank, and the world ahead woke on the far wall. A boy on a bicycle wobbled down a sidewalk. Cut. A marching band's brass tilted toward the same sun now trapped in the lamp. Cut. A backyard with a sprinkler that turned rain into a curtain. Cut. Empty leader with cigarette burns like small eclipses. Grain crawled and shook and invented stars. The auditorium wasn't a room, it was a storm. Dust rose, took the light-like input, and flung it back as noise. The shadows at the doorway did what all predators do when a pattern suddenly refuses to be itself. They hesitated. Their edges smeared, pulled, tried to hold. One leaned in and lost a piece of its shoulder, then found it again 2 feet to the left and a little smaller, as if the projector had edited it. It withdrew. Riley let his breath find a lane. You never fight a machine. You befriend its habits. The crank wanted a tempo and a pressure. Too slow, the shutter strobed. Too fast, the sprockets chewed. He felt each splice like a notch under his skin. He counted in prime numbers because even numbers invited sleep, and sleep invited drift, and drift invited prediction. June stood with her candle cupped and watched the doorway. Hank mapped exits with his eyes as if the walls would remember the favor later. Nadia sat cross-legged on the floor with the radio on her knee and her ear to the wire, tapping to nobody, to somebody, to a ghost. 3 short, 1 long, pause. 3 again. The city answered in static. Somewhere north, a church bell rang once and then thought better of it. They didn't talk about the column at St. Luke's until the projector proved it could keep a hole open. They didn't say the word safe. Riley allowed possible. After 5 minutes, the machine settled into its song. The booth got warm. The tin of rods sweated. The film hummed between the reels like a taut nerve that had decided not to snap. He risked a look through the porthole. The screen was alive in a way that wasn't metaphor. It breathed. It pulled images in and spit them out torn and better for being wrong. In the doorway, the shadows paced like wolves at the mouth of a fire, unwilling to cross, unwilling to leave. He meant to smile and didn't, because teeth were cues. "Call them," he said. Nadia's knuckles clicked. 2, 3, 2. They'd rehearsed the pattern with the pastor, palms on a stainless prep table, kids watching like a game. In the church kitchen, the column would unstack themselves from behind dry goods and break room chairs and bunk in behind June's rules. No rhythm, no pointing, no second looks. They would move by the sound of Nadia's code as if it were a rope. June checked her satchel. Scissors, gauze, tourniquets. The morphine ampules had turned the color of old tea. She had a blanket that used to live under an ambulance bench and a photo of a dog tucked under the flap. She didn't have a reason for the photo beyond the shape of its ears. Hank found a fire door near the stage that opened onto a side alley and wedged it. He tested the lock twice, not because he doubted the wedge, but because he needed to mark the door in his brain with a ritual. Riley turned. "How long on the rods?" Nadia glanced at the tin. "A while, if we don't ask for noon all the time." "Give them dawn and thunder," Hank said. They listened. The building made theater sounds. The memory of applause, the creak of boards that learned 100 different heels. Under that, new city sounds. A stoplight dying, a transformer adjusting its expectations. Under that, a third sound like breath held too long and the body about to insist on letting it go. Nadia's radio popped once, then twice. Then the click-click of a pastor who had memorized a code so his hands could keep busy when his voice ran out. She clicked back, then slid the wire under her collar because the skin knew where to keep hope warm. Riley kept the crank smooth. Sweat ran into his eyebrow and made his eye blink, and he fought the impulse to wipe because the film forgave nothing. The booth's metal belly warmed his knuckles. The shutter's letterbox flicked, 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 and the shutter answered with discipline, doing the one job it had ever been asked to do. He let himself admit a thing he had not allowed in days. This could hold. A sound rolled up through the building then, the kind you feel in your knees, a distant cable finding the end of its patience. The projector hiccuped. The film ticked wrong once, then slipped back on. He tasted copper. He eased pressure. The claw caught. The sprocket found its teeth. The image corrected. "Not now," he whispered, not to the machine, but to the city. June's candle haloed her face when she leaned to the porthole. "They're coming," she said. "I can feel it." "How?" Hank asked. She tilted her head. "Air changes when people decide to live." Riley nodded without looking. "Keep the door," he told Hank. "Nadia, ride the code every corner. June, first aid at the aisle. Pregnant and old first." I know she touched the satchel and didn't touch the photo. He sank deeper into the rhythm. The boy on the bicycle returned, older this time, hair too long, wind in his shirt. Cut. A parade where the tubas looked like silver planets. Cut. A backyard sprinkler that refused to spin. Grain danced. The world trembled on purpose. Outside the booth, at the top of the stairs, something dark leaned into the corridor and tasted the air with the flat of its edge. It found the light jagged. It found the noise rude. It did not like the feeling of not knowing the next thing. It withdrew into the wall like a stain sucked back into a cloth. Riley didn't see it. He didn't need to. The crank told him a story of resistance that light told him too, and the two stories agreed for once. He rolled his shoulders and let his hands forget themselves. Through the porthole, dust hung thick as weather, every mote a small refusal to align. The auditorium became the only honest room in the city, a place where prediction failed on schedule. He breathed with the machine until his breath was the machine. He counted primes and mixed them with the memory of footsteps on Wabash, rain on aluminum, the click of Nadia's teeth when she thought. He swapped out the first rod before it died. Clean, quick, a whispered surgery. Nadia held the cable steady so the light didn't go feral. Hank stood with the crowbar like a baton ready to call an orchestra that wasn't there. June opened the side door an inch to feel the alley's pressure. If it sucked, they were in trouble. It pressed. They had a little time. The radio clicked twice in a row, then three, then a long. Nadia smiled like she'd been paid. 2 blocks, she said. Riley didn't smile. He imagined the church kitchen, metal shelves, canned pears, a floor scrubbed with bleach and prayers. He pictured the pastor moving like a man carrying water in a cup, the kids mimicking the shuffles and wrong steps June had taught them, the old sax player cradling his horn like a sleeping dog. He imagined the column slipping through streets that no longer wanted to be streets, dodging shapes that preferred the moment right after a decision and right before the consequence. The booth hummed, the screen fluttered, the room held. He kept his shoulder loose, wrist easy, grip certain. He spoke to the projector without words, the way you speak to an animal that respects you when you respect it. The city outside tilted its ear to listen to a sound it didn't recognize, something messy and human, insisting on its mess in a measurable way. In the space between frames, he let one thought pass. If this works, it's because noise is grace and error is a kind of mercy. Then he cut the thought off because hope was a cue, and cues were invitations, and invitations got accepted. Nadia's fingers tapped, the arc burned steady, and the blinds of light kept slicing the dark into pieces. too small for the shadows to wear. Somewhere above, on a quiet street, feet without rhythm began to move. St. Luke's kitchen had the hush of a confession booth. Metal shelves held pyramids of cans like promises. A mop leaned in a corner as if listening. When June slipped in with a candle under a coffee can, the light cut a circle out of the bleach smell and the fear. "No lights," she said, and her voice went low and smooth, the voice you save for people whose bodies are already working too hard. "We're moving." Now the pastor, 50, tired, stubborn, nodded. He'd memorized Nadia's code and the rules. No rhythm, no pointing, no second looks. He'd taught the children to step on the tile grout in primes, the elders to breathe in counts that didn't repeat. The old saxophonist, left hand scarred into a claw, cradled his horn like a pet he couldn't keep. "Where?" he asked, not because he didn't know, but because the question steadied the flock. "Water," June said, "where edges break." They filed into the service alley by twos, cotton wrapped around shoes to drown squeaks, bandanas over mouths to hide the shine of teeth. Nadia took the rear with the radio under her coat and the code in her bones. Hank took point, crowbar under a jacket with the zipper broken at mid-chest. The pastor walked the spine of the column, one palm out for balance as if the air were a rail. There are ways to move that don't announce intention. Hunters know. So do people who've had to leave bars at the wrong hour. The column tried. They kept shoulders loose, eyes low, knees soft. Children hummed the wrong notes under their breath, off keys they'd practiced like a dare. The city didn't like it. The city liked daylight savings and bank closing hours and 60 hertz. The city liked a calendar. Tonight, the city had a new preference, a future it could predict. They cut south and then east in a stagger that was almost dance and not. On the wall of a hair salon, a mural of a woman's face looked down with painted concern that refused to follow their motion. On the second block, a shadow peeled off a doorway and began to mirror the column at a measured distance, its outline person-shaped until it hit a curb and slid through it like smoke. The pastor's hand twitched toward it. He caught himself. Rule 2, no pointing. Your arm is a tracer. Nadia tapped the radio 3 quick, 1 long, the theater's hello, and paused to taste the air. The click came back thin but honest. She felt the code settle the column's spine. She was the rope. Riley was the anchor. They crossed Wabash under the tracks where dripping iron fell in the same places it always had. Hank squinted at the pavement. The drops were spaced wrong tonight, slowing, then sprinting, then pausing together as if listening. He altered their line a hair so a rust drip landed between his steps instead of on a heel that would squeal. The saxophonist set a shuffle. Step, step, stop, step, step, stop. Kids matched it like a game. Shadows hate games they can't win. At the corner of Polk, a plastic grocery bag leapt in a gust and sailed like a white fish. A little boy broke pattern, sprinted after it, fingertips out. June hooked him by the shoulders mid-run, spun him into her chest with a blasphemy murmured against his hair. The shadow at the curb kinked its head and lengthened as if testing the boy-shaped gap that had almost opened. "Keep going," Nadia whispered without moving her lips. "No stalls?" They slid past a brick arch where 2 stone cherubs had once tried to look benevolent. Their faces had been rubbed smooth by 1,000 careless hands long before any of this. Now they were blank coins. The alley widened, then tightened. 2 dumpster lids gaped like tongues. The city dead-ended, then reconsidered. The group threaded a silence between these facts. The shadows were patient. They didn't lunge. They didn't need to. They hung where corners should be and made those corners late. One skimmed along a windowsill until the window forgot it had glass and presented whatever it was becoming instead. Another hugged a lamppost that had been painted over so many times the paint had its own weight. They tracked knees, breath, the twitch of a hand toward a pocket that used to have a phone in it, and when a movement repeated, they leaned forward, hungry for the next beat. Nadia tapped twice, then three, then a long. The answer came stronger now, a current the column could lean on. The theater was close. Riley's noise was cutting a hole big enough to walk through. The marquee lay like ribs on the sidewalk. The entrance gaped. Hank slid in and gestured with a chin. The gesture caught in the light like a cue, and he swore under his breath for breaking his own rule. June went next. Then the pastor and the first cluster of families. Nadia turned and looked back up the block without looking at anything in particular. The shadows had compressed into a line across the street like a firewall, an edge that wasn't light and wasn't dark, so much as a decision stretched thin. Down the stairs, the air changed, cooler, mold-sweet, crushed velvet memory. The sub-level felt narrower than earlier, as if the building had exhaled and decided not to inhale again. The projection flicker leaked under the booth door like a heartbeat. Riley held his speed steady. In the auditorium, the war was gorgeous. A boy on a bicycle toppled toward the camera, then became a parade, then someone's lawn, then blank leader, then grain like rain. Lights shuddered. Dust took sides. Every slice made a new wrong. The shadows at the doorway did the math and didn't like the answer. Their edges settled frayed. They leaned in and came back smelling like hot metal. "First through," June said, planting at the aisle with her satchel open. Pregnant, old, hurt, hands on shoulders, no stopping. If you fall, you crawl. If you can't crawl, you slide. The pastor took the rear of the first string and counted in primes, not out loud, not with his lips, but in the tendon of his neck. Hank opened the fire door at the side of the stage, a crack, and tested the pressure. It pressed outward. Good. If the alley wanted in, they were dead. "Now," Nadia said, and she put a hand between the shoulder blades of the woman in front of her. The smallest nudge, the first domino. They moved into the light. It touched them wrong and then right again. The projector threw the film at them, and the film tried to make sense of them and failed. Their faces became puzzle pieces for a blink, and then whole people again. The exact kind of mistake the shadows couldn't predict. Feet scuffed and didn't echo. Hands reached and didn't cast themselves. Bodies went blotched, then stippled, then true. At the doorway, a shadow made a decision. It tested the storm with an edge like a blade, and the blade came back with no handle. It split across the strobe, lost its middle, and reassembled off-tempo, a beat late to a song it had been leading all week. Two more tried, and both came back small, child-sized, with their heads too neat. They gave up size to buy coherence, failed the transaction, dissolved like smoke, finding no draft. Riley kept the crank smooth, the tempo sitting in his forearm like a metronome only he could hear. Nadia's radio clicked to a rhythm he tried not to internalize. Hank counted heads into the mouth of the side door, flicking eye contact. You. June slipped a hand under a pregnant woman's elbow without ceremony and lifted. The woman's face broke and re-knit, tears turning into light, into water, into sweat, and none of it landing. The saxophonist hesitated when the beam caught his bell and poured itself up into the mouth. He felt the wrongness of reflection with his fingers, then looked at June and let the horn go. It fell without noise and slid into an orchestra pit that was now a shadow, then a shape, then a memory. He reached for a child instead, and that was music enough. From the booth, metal sang, a low, unwilling note. The projector coughed once, a hiccup like a scratched disc. The film shuddered a frame out of place, slurred back in, hiccuped again. "Riley," Nadia said soft. She didn't look away from the aisle. He eased tension, felt the claw slip, coaxed it back into the perforations like needle to groove. Heat jumped off the lamp head, peeled the hair on his forearms. He could feel the tin of carbon rods warming on the shelf at his left shoulder. He could smell the stock, vinegar and basement, and a past that had died in bright rooms. He could smell another thing too, insistence. The image froze. On the screen, a 2-lane road with telephone poles running into a sky so pale it hardly counted. The grain stopped crawling. The jitter stopped jittering. The world became a diagram. Every shadow in the doorway straightened like soldiers at attention. "No," Hank breathed. He didn't know to whom. Riley cranked harder. The sprockets resisted and then refused. The film had softened into tack and then sugar. The gate held it like a hand that didn't know when to let go. "Power off, we clean, Hank started. "There's no time for a clean," June said, eyes on the aisle, hands on a man whose legs had decided to be uncooperative. The column hesitated one collective fraction. People falter when a future stops. The auditorium sensed it and did what rooms do when their purpose changes. It became throat. The shadows' heads tilted in unison. They had recognized a beat. They had decided to eat it. Riley took inventory the way you do when you know the answer and want to argue anyway. Tools, bent. Rag, a fossil. Time, none. Film, flammable. Shadows, hungry for sameness. He could feel the projector's one demand, consistency, turning into a liability that would drown them all. He set his jaw against a prayer and found instead a decision. "Get them out," he said. "I'll make the storm bigger." "How?" Hank's eyes never left the door. "Fire!" June cut her glance toward the booth for the first and last time. "Riley, go." He wrapped his hands in the dead rag until the cloth scuffed his knuckles. He yanked the carbon leads free. Sparks leapt and landed in his hair, smoldered, died. He drove his shoulder into the panel until the casing folded and gave him the space to reach the bin. He shoved the burning rag into the belly of the film like a lie you tell knowing it will become truth. Nitrate remembered itself. Light went from instrument to animal. The beam that had been a room became a weapon. The frozen poles shattered into 1,000 verticals that fell sideways, then into letters in an alphabet nobody had lived long enough to learn. Heat shoved back at the booth door and made the air in his throat taste like pennies. His eyebrows curled, his eyes watered, and didn't care why. On the floor the shadows tore, not apart, with nothing inside. There is nothing to spill but along their assumptions. Their edges frayed until they looked like fog, trying to hold a knife. They didn't scream. The absence of their comfort screamed for them. The doorway lost its appetite. "Move!" Hank bellowed, and the column did. The pregnant woman shuffled and then slid. The old man whose feet were traitors went on his knees, and people behind him didn't step on him, didn't stop either. They lifted with forearms and thighs, learned a new geometry on the fly. The pastor put a tiny boy onto his hip, and the boy made a small involuntary laugh at the way the world pixelated around him and came back. Nadia ran the aisle in jagged darts like a gnat that refused to be swatted, her hand tapping limbs into momentum, her mouth ticking code toward the back where fear had pooled. June's voice went flint. Eyes up. Breathe wrong. If you stop, I break your toe so you remember how to move. Riley kept one palm on the wheel as if he could fool the projector into thinking it still had a friend. He hadn't meant to die when he woke in the laundromat that morning, meaning it now sat on him like a coat that fit. He watched the storm he had made fill the room with a light that refused to repeat itself. He had wanted resistance to look like code. In the end, it looked like the oldest disobedience, flame. The booth turned into an oven that knew his name. He stepped back to the far wall and pulled the door wide to drag the heat into the auditorium faster, to widen the blind spot at the expense of everything else. The machine groaned a final music. The rag flamed through his wraps and found the meat of his hands. Pain arrived and took a seat and crossed its legs. Through the porthole, June looked up once. She didn't smile. She didn't shake her head. She touched 2 fingers to temple, then heart, then floor. Remember, love, hold, and turned back to the living. Hank cleared the last row, booted the side door open with a noise that didn't echo, and made a gate of his body. Go, go, go! The pastor's palm landed on his shoulder. The boy on the pastor's hip looked dirt-streaked and astonished. The first nose met the alley's air and flinched from the taste of smoke and metal and outside. Nadia counted them through with her fingertips, 1 press per spine. 31, 32, 32 and a half, because the pregnant woman counted twice. 33, 30. She refused to say the last number in her head because names like that stuck in you. Riley kicked the carbon feed so it jammed irregularly and spat. The light went lunatic, 1,000 new wrongs every second. The shadows at the doorway lost their last purchase and smeared across the stage like spilled ink trying to climb. For a breath, the city outside paused. The grid, the clocks, the hungry prediction machine orbiting, and then reasserted itself with a pressure drop that made the booth tremble. Last 4! June's voice cut through flame and code. She shoved the saxophonist ahead of her. His empty hands looked surprised. The pastor ducked his gray head without bowing. The boy clamped one arm around the pastor's neck and reached his free hand toward the storm as if to touch a lion's mane. Nadia planted her palm on the door and felt the hinge heat up. The metal would fail soon. It needed to. If the door fused, they'd be trapped here in the room they'd made into a weapon. She didn't let herself look up at the porthole again. If she looked, she'd stop. If she stopped, she'd contribute to a rhythm the shadows could love. Hank hooked June's elbow and yanked. They fell through the threshold in a tangle and rolled once. Cold alley air slapped them and took their breath the way truth does. Behind them, the auditorium flared white and then mad gold. Heat licked their backs like a dog deciding whether to bite. Riley braced his shoulder against the booth wall long enough to take one more breath that hurt like the first one you ever take. He thought of the laundromat and the taped paper rules and the way the lake smelled like coins when the wind came right. He thought of the boy on the bicycle and how boys stay up because someone runs behind the seat with a hand out until they don't need it. He thought, keep them moving. Go, he said, to the hallway, to the city, to whoever still listened. The fire roared acceptance. The film turned into a river of light you couldn't stand in twice. Smoke rolled down the stairs like a stubborn weather front. The booth door frame buckled, then bellowed, then sagged. Hank slammed the side door, threw the wedge, and shouldered it as if he could hold the building up with bone. Nadia dragged the pastor to his feet. June counted heads with hands, not numbers. The boy laughed once more, involuntary at the taste of heat, and then hid his face in the pastor's collar. They stumbled into the alley, into air that felt like mint and iron, into a night that had been dimmed by something in orbit with a steady hand. The marquee groaned above them like a rib cage, remembering it had one more breath in it. The column became a line, and then a hurry, and then a silence with feet. Behind, the theaters inside became outside in a single hot exhale. The projection storm blew itself apart. A wheel spun once without a hand and then stopped for the last time. "South," Hank said, and his voice sounded like a man saying his own name to remember it. They ran without rhythm toward Dearborn. The shadows did not follow into the alley. They hung at the edge of the door like a rule cleaned off a blackboard. Nadia clicked the radio to a nowhere that still felt like a path. June held the small boy and the bag of gauze and nothing else. The pastor whispered primes, not as numbers now, but as prayer. They cleared the mouth of the alley and spilled onto the street. The night air hit them full, and the block beyond was wrong in a way none of their rules had accounted for. They burst from the alley as if thrown, heat snapping at their backs, smoke tugging at their lungs. The night air hit like metal held too long in the mouth. Hank said, "South," and they obeyed because obeying was easier than thinking. Then the block opened, and the world failed to meet them where the street should have been. A mess of patched asphalt and oil blooms, there was a surface without seams, not water, not glass, something that refused to be touched by adjectives. Curbs were implied, not present. Manhole covers showed their circles but had no rings, no bolts. Parking lines hovered like chalk in air. Light didn't reflect. It agreed. June's feet slid forward and didn't squeak. The boy on her hip stiffened with the small animal shock of a new texture. Hank knelt, pressed his fingers flat, then curled them, hunting for grit, for anything to argue with. His knuckles creaked in the quiet. "It's not a floor," he said finally. "It's a decision." Nadia lifted the radio to her ear like a seashell. Click, click. The signal landed and vanished as if the surface had eaten it and learned nothing. No echo, no refusal, just acceptance. She tried again and again, thumb-tapping a message into a world that didn't believe in messages anymore. The pastor stopped beside her and put his palm down. Skin met no temperature. He pulled back as if burned, because absence can scald too. Behind them, the theater coughed out a single hot breath and swallowed itself. The alley filled with glittering ash that drifted toward the open street as if curious. Bits of film stuck to jackets and cheeks, then sank into the surface with the obscene ease of rain becoming river. June wiped the boy's face with the heel of her hand and felt the grit disappear under her skin. She didn't tell him. She didn't have a word that wouldn't turn into a cue. They moved. What else was there? Testing steps like blind swimmers testing the shape of a pool. The column stretched into a line, legs uncertain, a prayer of knees. The saxophonist reached for the strap that wasn't on his shoulder and found his hand rising to a mouth that didn't need it. He dropped the gesture and took a toddler from a woman who would have wept if weeping still worked. The first building on the corner had kept its silhouette, but misplaced its windows. You could draw the bricks with your eyes, but your eyes would be lying. The bricks wouldn't meet your hand. The deli where Riley once bought coffee had a chalkboard with no dust. The letters were outlines, the chalk a concept. The dog under the board slept nowhere. "Keep moving," June said, and the words steadied her because they were work, not memory. They crossed the block in wrong silence, the kind you can't hang a thought on. Nadia tried the radio again. Click, click. She measured each click against the pulse in her wrist. The pastor began the primes and lost them after 19 when the next number refused to line up behind it. He mouthed 21 anyway and felt his body betray the count. He closed his lips and clenched his hands and found no friction in his palms. The second intersection, the city ended again. Not a drop, not a cliff. It continued in perfect continuation, as if someone had copied and pasted a street and missed the paste. A car embedded in the surface sat with its tires half swallowed, doors sealed in a smooth that told you the car had never had doors at all. Street signs were present the way dreams are present, letters erased, poles without texture. A shadow would have loved the edges, if edges still existed. Nothing cast, nothing fell, nothing hid. Hank took off his boots and walked a step on bare skin, stubborn as a man refusing to let the future be impolite. He expected cold or heat or the humiliation of slipping. He found none of it. Interface, he said, or primer, or paint. He didn't sound like he believed any of the three. The boy wriggled down from June's hip with a solemnity that made him heavier than his weight. He crouched. "Can I slide?" "Try," June said. If this world wanted children to stop asking, it would have to earn the silence. He pushed to glide. His shoes didn't catch and didn't skate. Movement happened, then didn't. He frowned like a scientist. He stood, having learned nothing and everything. He took June's hand without looking. They turned toward the river because water remembers, because water is the body's oldest map. The river was there, but it didn't move. A strip of darkness held by will, surface so still the city's outline lay on it like a sheet. June leaned forward until her reflection admitted her, then flinched. The face that looked back was too legible, edges too clean, the human smudge corrected, as if the surface had tidied her into a version it preferred. The pastor knelt, thumbed the sign of a cross that had steadied more than one disaster. His hand kept moving after he finished, the muscle memory seeking a ritual that matched this. None did. He began the Lord's Prayer and lost it in the middle where the hinge goes, "On earth as it is in," because earth and as and is had been robbed of their seams. He closed his mouth. He opened his hands. He looked at the boy with a helplessness that would have broken him in any other world. Here it just diffused, absorbed, resolved to smooth. "Riley," Nadia said. It was prayer and curse and receipt. June didn't answer. She had a picture of the booth lodged where anger lives, the rag, the carbon, the heat. Riley's eyebrows singed to frail commas, the little two-finger code, remember, love, hold. She tried to feel relief, tried to let sorrow do the decent work of softening. The surface ate both. It accepted. It didn't echo. The only weight left was the boy's hand. Hank paced the edge of the unmoving water and dropped a bolt he'd scavenged a mile back. It fell, and the sound never returned. He listened too long for it. Then he laughed once joyless and put the boots back on because ritual is a spine. Nadia set the radio down very gently, as if tucking a child in. She folded the antenna, unspooled it again, folded it a second time so the hinge would remember being a hinge. "If I stop clicking," she said, "it's because my thumb came off." "Keep clicking," June said. It wasn't a command. It was a way to tell the world they were still here. They moved along the river's implied margin. On a normal night, it would have smelled like algae and diesel and a little rot. Tonight, it smelled like nothing, like a page without ink. The bridge was a drawing, arches perfect, rivets present only as circles of intention. They crossed anyway because your legs don't know how to not turn distance into past. Halfway, the boy tugged June's sleeve. "What happens if we jump?" "We walk," she said, and this time she heard the cruelty in telling the truth. Behind them, where the theater had been, the smoke thinned into a slate sheet. Somewhere under the smooth, the old city lay with all its ugly kindnesses, rust, rattle, grit, the stubborn music of New Year's fireworks from last year. Memory tried to climb and found no purchase. The saxophonist flexed his fingers and waited for a note the air didn't know how to hold. He lifted his hands to a mouthpiece that wasn't there and made the shape of breath. A sound appeared in his head, clean and private. It went nowhere else. He lowered his hands and looked toward the sky as if it might lean down and finish the phrase for him. It didn't. "Do we keep moving?" the pastor asked. And it was the most human question in a place that had eaten humanity's scaffolding. "We do," June said. "We do until we can't." They stepped off the bridge into a district that had never been gentle even when it was honest. Now it was pleasant in the way of an unblemished wall. Stores stood, names gone, windows present as ideas. The column had become smaller without anyone leaving it. Edges and count had slipped. Nadia touched shoulders to tally and came up with a number that wouldn't settle, like a radio between stations. The boy's hand tightened when the wind pressed, a nothing breeze set to a constant, the kind you forget to notice in a world that values variation. June squeezed back. "Tell me about your dog," she said, "because stories make corners to lean into." "I don't have a dog," he said, and then, after a moment, "Can I have one?" He wasn't pleading, he was calibrating. "Yeah," June said, "we'll find one that barks at everything." The pastor huffed a laugh that made no sound. Hank's shoulders eased half an inch, then remembered and locked again. Nadia exhaled like a person remembering a song. For a thin second, desire did what it has always done, wrote a small refusal inside the given. Atlas rolled overhead somewhere, the invisible hand on the dimmer, steady and unmerciful. The sky went a shade lighter, then darker, without the grace of sunrise or the honesty of night. The city's silhouette stayed. The world became a perfect diagram that insisted it was enough. At the next corner, the same corner, every corner, the smooth changed, not in texture, in promise. June smelled it before she saw it, the phantom of rain on asphalt that wasn't, the ghost of worms rising. Her chest flared with it, an ache like hunger. She slowed. The column did too, by habit. In the middle of the intersection, the boy let go of her hand and crouched. He pressed his ear to the surface and listened. "What do you hear?" June asked, bending, her palm hovering over his spine. He frowned, concentrating the way you do when you try to recall a name without looking up the contact. "I hear nothing," he said. Then, after a beat that had been stolen from music, "If I stay here, will it say something?" June thought of Riley, of the booth, of the wheel spinning once by itself after he was gone, because machines remember you for a second when you leave them. She heard her own breath, shallow and wrong. She wanted to pound the surface with both fists until imperfection returned, until the city confessed it had corners left. She wanted to see a shadow, if only to have something to argue with. She sat beside the boy and put her ear down too. The surface accepted the shape of her skull without complaint. No hum, no grit whispering its arithmetic, no secret current. Her pulse tried to serve a story and found itself alone. She lifted her head. "It'll talk if we keep moving," she lied, because sometimes the body needs a future even when the future is a rumor. They rose. Nadia clicked the radio once, then once again, and then she stopped. Not because her thumb came off, not because hope had emptied, but because a new truth settled in her bones. The click wasn't a rope anymore. It was a metronome, and the surface adored metronomes. She slid the radio into the pastor's bag where a loaf of bread had been yesterday or earlier today or in a different city altogether. Hank pointed, not with his arm, with his chin, with the old mechanic's nod you use when your hands are busy and the engine is listening. Ahead, the river's second bend lay like a pencil mark the page forgot to absorb. Beyond it, the lake, its horizon, a line drawn by a machine that didn't blink. "Water," he said. "If anything moves, it'll be the big body." "And if it doesn't?" the pastor asked. "We walk anyway," June answered. "We keep riding our shapes until the world runs out of a racer." They moved, thinner now, stretched into a filament. Their shadows, when there had been light enough for such, would have made a braid. Here, the light was perfect and cast nothing. The city was legible, readable, obedient. The surface made room for their feet and then forgot them at once. On the last block before the lake, the saxophonist stopped. He lifted both hands and held them in the air as if gripping a horn, as if gripping a steering wheel, as if gripping the throat of whatever had done this. He took a breath and blew. Nothing came. He blew again, harder, cheeks ballooning, eyes wet. A note arrived in his head, a clean, private C that should have opened the blues like a door, and nowhere else. The pastor watched him with a compassion that hurt to carry. "We'll remember the sound," he said, and the words looked good in the air, well-made furniture in an empty house. They sat, they held, they vanished, they reached the lake. It lay like a fact, flat as a lie told beautifully. June stepped to the waterline and put the boy down. He squatted and tapped the surface with 2 fingers. The tap didn't spread, didn't make rings, didn't persuade anything to move. He looked at June, at Nadia, at Hank, at the pastor. "Maybe we are the water now," he said, apologizing to no one. June took his hand. "Maybe," she said. She wasn't sure if that was surrender or a kind of courage. They followed the curve because curves are where cities forgive themselves. The lake gave them nothing. No wind, no gulls, no tugboats speaking diesel under their breath. The shore had no trash. Clean was the wrong word. Clean is earned. This was corrected. June looked back exactly once. Smoke did not rise where the theater had been. The grid did not blink. There was no shadow to fear and no shadow to hide in. The only movement came from them, from the quiet machinery of bodies insisting on continuing. She thought of Riley's hand on the wheel, of how the projector had hummed like a heart, of how the last good room in a dying city had been the one that chose noise. She let herself feel it, just enough to sting. The surface tried to take it. She held on. They walked until the lake became a straight line with no past and no promise. When they stopped, it wasn't because the world told them to. It was because their legs required an answer to the question of next, and none was forthcoming. The pastor sat. Hank stood with his hands on his hips like a man at the end of a job and no invoice to write. Nadia tucked her hands under her arms to keep from clicking. June knelt so the boy could lean into her side and watch the horizon not change. "Tell me when you hear something," he whispered. "I will," she said. She meant it. Above them, Atlas turned, a blade without a handle, a judge without a face. The sky dimmed 2 degrees and brightened 3 in a rhythm that wasn't 1. The light stayed perfect. No shadows gathered. June lifted her fingers to her temple, then her heart, then the ground. "Remember, love, hold." The gesture landed without echo and stayed anyway. They waited, and when waiting became the only thing left to do, they did that too. Small figures on a flawless edge, listening for a heartbeat under a surface that had been taught to refuse all sound, mouths ready to name the first ripple if it ever came.